So what I'm going to do in this video is going to take an introduction to Stuart Britain, and we're going to introduce the sort of set the stage for what we're going to look at in this course, and we're going to do that by looking at the idea of the political nation and the sort of the social basis of power. So we're going to outline a number of things. We're going to have a look at what it means, what the political nation was and what it means. We're going to look at the Stuart monarchs of Great Britain, the power that the monarchy had at the start of the 1600s, the way the constitution influenced the power of the monarchy. We're going to have a look at other groups within the political nation, and then we're going to have a look at the social basis of power. So as a general introduction to Stuart Britain, it must be said that England in the 1600s was a period of social unrest, civil war and revolution. And this was generally the understanding of the Stuart age. And it was a period of time marked by social divisions. And while England was still agricultural economy, it was still also dominated by small elite groups of landowners. So we're going to start to, as we go through, we're going to have a look and see that the kind of divisions, the kind of dichotomies that existed within English society at this time. And also religion was still played a very important role in society, and there was a lot of religious divides between Catholicism and Protestantism after tensions that arose under the Tudor era. And this is an example of a Tudor monarch. This is the final Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, who was the monarch before James I, who is the first monarch of the Tudor age, of the Stuart age. When it comes to the political nation, what we mean by the political nation is that it refers to people in early modern Britain who had economic, political and social influence. A group of people that had economic, political and social influence. And this was usually expressed and existed as land ownership. People who were landowners had this ability to influence policy, influence politics, and had economic standing. And in this political nation, it was seen that the monarch was the head, was the top of this political nation. Okay, and the monarchy was still the most important constant throughout the Stuart era. When it comes to the Stuart monarchs themselves, we have James I, who we'll look at first, who reigned from 1603 to 1625. This is followed by Charles from 1625 to 1649. And then Charles II, 1660 to 1685, James II, 1685 to 1688, and then finally we have William and Mary, who both started their reign in 1689, and William finished his reign in 1701, Mary 1694. So when it comes to the power of the monarchy, again we're looking at this is an image of a Tudor monarch, because this is what we're sort of taking. To understand really the Stuart monarchy, we have to really have a look at where the Tudors left off, how the society existed in England. So through the royal prerogative, monarchs led the political nation. They would shape politics, economics and the social life of Britain. The royal prerogative gave the monarch power over the following things. So we have foreign policy. They had the power of foreign policy as they were head of state. They had the power to declare war as they were commander-in-chief. They had the power over legislation, a sort of pseudo-power over legislation, because they could control Parliament by calling it and dissolving it whenever they wanted. Okay? And they also had power of religion ever since this person here, Henry VIII, became the supreme governor of the Church of England. So this is suggestive that the monarchy as a concept was absolutist, and by absolutist we mean that it had ultimate power and could rule freely. The problem with this notion is that monarch's power sits with their finances. Okay, and we're going to look in a couple of videos time at the finances of James and Charles and see how the monarch's financial position really did control the monarch's power to influence other people. So limits to these finances would therefore limit absolutism of the monarchy. And a century of inflation meant that the monarch was unable to pay for the things that they wanted to pay for with the expenses that they were given. So their expenses didn't change, but inflation kept increasing. So as we'll be able to see that finances started to become a real big political issue during this period. And substantial funds could only be effectively raised through parliamentary subsidies, which gave Parliament a certain amount of power. So the problem with this idea of parliamentary subsidies was that Parliament was reluctant to vote for these subsidies themselves. This is because it would mean greater taxation of the political nation. So Parliament was ultimately a part of the political nation, and they knew that if the monarch wanted subsidies from Parliament, then this money would come from taxing the political nation, and they didn't want to do that. So Parliament ultimately represented this political nation, despite supposedly representing the country. Okay, so as we will start to see, they had a vested interest in not wanting to vote for these subsidies, since they were representing the political nation, who are the people that would have to pay for this subsidy. Okay, and therefore we start to see tension arise between the monarch and Parliament. And this reluctance to vote for subsidies meant that the monarch could only really rely on the prerogative income, which was mainly things like crown lands, custom duties, and feudal dues. So the problem with relying on the prerogative for financial aid was that Parliament was always uneasy with this thinking, since it would mean that the monarch could wield absolute power. The Parliament ultimately controlled the monarch's power, but if the monarch could simply wield this through the royal prerogative, then that would take away a certain check on the power of the monarchy from Parliament. And the ability to limit the monarch's power was really a key feature of Parliament during this period of time. And it could also be said that the monarch was limited because of his relationship with the political nation, because the monarch relied on the political nation for a number of vital roles, so i.e. tax collection. So we start to see that this idea of the monarch being absolutist is really not a very concise or convincing idea, especially during the Stuart era, because you have the power of Parliament over the monarchy to ensure that to limit their finances, and you also have the power of the political nation over the monarchy for a number of vital roles like tax collection. So this reliance ultimately limited absolutism in the monarchy. Another limit to the monarch's power, and another sort of a big influence that really became important during this period, was the role of the UK Constitution. So the UK Constitution plays a key role in issues during the Stuart era, not necessarily because of the contents of the Constitution, but rather the nature of the Constitution. So the UK Constitution was, and still is today, what we call uncodified. This means it's not all written down in one place. So this means that the Constitution does not exist as like a single document. If we wanted to, for example, get to Google, for example, the US Constitution, you would be able to find it in one single document. You can actually purchase the US Constitution in one single document. You can't do that with the UK Constitution. The UK Constitution is made up of a number of sources, including statute law, common law, different conventions, etc., all built over thousands of years. So it becomes less clear what the Constitution actually says, which is really where the issues start to come up. So because it's not very clear what the Constitution actually clearly states, the UK Constitution is open to interpretation and disagreement, and we'll see that becomes a big issue during the Stuart era. Moreover, we can also look at other groups that formed up this political nation. So we've talked a lot about the monarch and the power of the monarch, and the power where power ultimately lies within the monarchy. Let's have a look at other areas of the political nation. So the political nation was made up of a number of social groups. This included things like the aristocracy, the gentry, generally based on land ownership, and really if we compare the political nation with the rest of the country, the population was around 4 million at the time of the Stuart age. That's the whole country, and of this, the political nation made up less than 50,000 people. Some argue that it's even less than 20,000 or 30,000. So if you wanted to do the statistics on that, it ultimately comes to the point where a very, 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 very small percentage of the population wields the majority of the power, and that's an imbalance that will come up later on. We'll start to see the developments of this throughout the 1600s. So, to be seen as a member of the political nation, this is a little bit of just a little information about how one could become a part of the political nation. One must have an income of around 40 shillings, and this was also the minimum requirement to become a candidate for Parliament, to become an MP. However, it must be said that most MPs were selected rather than went themselves to become a candidate. So, as we've generally looked at other groups that form the political nation, things like the aristocracy and effectively the top 1% of the population, what does it mean when we talk about the social basis of the political nation's power? So it must be said that the political nation itself had no enforcement power. There was no police, there was nothing like that going on in this period of time. But despite the fact that it couldn't actually physically enforce its power and authority over the rest of the country, the power of the political nation was just generally seen and accepted by those who were on the lower end of the social hierarchy. So the social basis still remained strong despite this rapid population growth between 1500 and 1650, a population that doubled effectively in that time. And again, with the population growth, that came with a number of different problems. So you have economic inflation, you have food shortages, land shortages, you have unemployment. Okay, these are all the kind of things that happen when you have rapid population growth and you don't have rapid economic development to sort of go alongside it. All of these issues would eventually strain the class system in England. So couple the growth of population with harvest failures in the 1620s, and we start to begin to see the extent of famine and starvation on the lower social classes. So things start piling up, and the class system in England starts to strain. All this was happening while the top of the social class was effectively getting richer. And despite all these problems, despite the economic issues, despite the famine, despite the fact that the social class at the top of the list was getting richer, the power of the political nation was very rarely challenged. And it was really one of the reasons was this idea of a great chain of being, which suggests that God had ordered society himself to be structured in this sort of hierarchy. And so really any kind of the structure of society was seen as sacrosanct, as in it wasn't really you weren't allowed to question the social structure because it was all ordered by God. So there were sometimes riots, it must be said. So despite the high social standing, there were sometimes riots. However, these riots had very little impact and were seen as minor and small disputes rather than large-scale revolts. So it still must be said that there were riots and there were sort of social unrest, a little bit of social unrest, but at the same time, the overall view of the political nation was that of just a sort of a passive understanding. They didn't really have much. They didn't really care much for it, and they generally accepted the power of the political nation. So in conclusion from this video, we've had a look at the state of society in Britain and the impact that had on the Stuart age. We looked at the idea of the monarch being the top of this political nation. We looked at the idea of the monarch not being entirely absolutist because of the impact of finance controls through Parliament and other political controls from the rest of the political nation. And we've also looked for this drive for absolutism, creating tension between the monarch and Parliament. and despite the huge social inequalities that existed at the start of the 1600s, there was very little rebellion against the political nation.